Sean is about to get us started as soon as he activates his mic, but I wanted to hop in real quickly and say thanks to Chris Lemons for being our note taker.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, hey, welcome to WPACK. We didn't meet last time. This time I figured we might as well do it and try to spin stuff up and get things restarted. So here's the it's the end of the week, so hopefully you've seen these before. If you're just tuning us, we're going to do a little bit of updates about IETF and process stuff. Basically, the reason why we have your video turned off is we don't want to crush the servers. If you're going to talk, feel free to turn them on, as I will now, so you can see my face and my ever-growing beard. The Meet Echo link is there. Obviously, the audio only and the CodeEMD notes are there, and that's where Chris is going to be taking notes for us. Note D well. Again, hopefully you've been around this week and you've seen this before. Basically, IPR rules, if you're going to participate, you need to kind of understand what they are. If you know something, say something. Also, we have a code of conduct, so let's keep it professional. If you have any questions about any of these, you can ask the chairs. Francisca, who is our responsible area director, she and Marie did a little bit of a chair swap, or any of the other people that you see in the list on the left that you might have seen around a lot at a lot of the other meetings. We're perfectly willing to answer those questions. Again, we're at WPACK. It's only one more session after this. If this is not the right place, though, there are other sessions going on. Myself and Dave are the chairs. Agenda, pretty simple. We have one topic today, which is basically about trying to get us to adopt the bundle format. Document as a starting point. It is definitely not the thing that's done. It's going to take some time to review it, and so people have to consider that when we get to the point where we're trying to figure out what we're going to do with it. Is there anybody that wants to bash the agenda to add anything else? All right, I think we're going to go ahead, and Jeffrey, I will hand it over to you. So go ahead and grab the audio. You can present video if you would like. I'll run the slides though.
Cool. Yeah, having you run the slides is great.
Jeffrey, do you have a particular preference if somebody wants to jump in during the slide, or would you prefer to wait till the end?
I am happy to take interruptions.
Okay, thank you.
We should have plenty of time to get through the slides. Yeah, so I'm Jeffrey Eskin. I use he, him pronouns, and I will be describing the current draft of the bundle format in the hopes that we can decide to adopt it at this meeting. Next slide. Well, as I said, next slide again. So the overall structure of this draft is it describes the semantics of the format. It describes some expectations for the performance of implementations. It then describes the format. The big change from draft 3 to draft 4 is that I removed the structuring it around algorithms to parse the format and changed it to a description of the format itself, which I believe makes it easier to read. The format has an invariant bit, it has sections, and it ends with the total length, which allows using it in things like self-extracting executables. And then it defines the set of sections that kind of every implementation would implement. And then we can add extra sections in extension documents. And it has a security consideration section. Next slide. So the overall semantics are that a bundle is a set of HTTP representations. Those representations are themselves represented by HTTP response messages plus information from the index. Representations are named by URLs and content negotiation information. But in a later slide, there's a proposal to change that. Next slide. So bundles have two kind of modes that they can operate in. One is stored on a random access disk or SD card or something. And for those, you have to load the index to start reading anything, and then you go straight to the resource bytes. You can also stream a bundle. There's two kind of notions of streaming, or two aspects of streaming. Stream generation, so if the sender doesn't have the whole thing before it wants to start serving a request, it needs to know all the resource sizes before it starts sending anything. The receiver can also stream something that that the sender had pre-cached. For that, there's kind of a wavefront of how much it has received, and it can return a resource a constant number of bytes behind what it has received. Next slide. So the overall format is a CBOR object. There's a magic number, a version number, a primary URL that's also used to fall back if, for instance, the client doesn't understand the version, but there's a proposal to change that in a later slide. There's the section index, which gives offsets to the beginnings of each of the sections in the bundle, the sections themselves, and then a total size. Okay, next slide. The core sections that are defined in this document are the index, which gives a map from the name of the response to the byte range in the responses section. So that enables random access. There's a manifest URL, which could point to something like an app manifest for things on the web. EPUB has a manifest document. There could be other sorts of manifests, and this kind of just points to one of those. Again, there's a proposal to change that. A critical section, which defines the set of sections that are kind of critical to understand in order to get the semantics right. That's to some extent inspired by other formats rather than a concrete need right now. And then the responses section, and an IANA registry to add new kinds of sections in other documents. Next slide. So Daniel Ehrenberg has submitted a couple PRs to mostly remove things from the initial draft. And I wanted to get the sense of the working group, about whether to include or reject those PRs for the purposes of adopting the document. We can change our minds later as the document evolves. So don't feel like this is your last chance to accept these PRs. Or we can undo our decision if we take a PR and decide we should re-add one of the things it removed. Next slide. The motivation for these changes, and Daniel can jump in if I get anything wrong or answer more questions if people want more details. The current draft supports both using a bundle to represent sub-resources of a page and using it to represent kind of a whole page all at once, like as the top level resource. It appears that sub-resource loading needs fewer features than loading as a whole page, and there are more questions about whether all browsers will or all clients will support loading a top-level page from a bundle. And so he's proposing to remove the things that aren't needed for sub-resource loading. Next slide. And I'm not following the jabber, so if you want me to talk about any of that, raise your hand.
Well, actually, Jeffrey, Daniel just jumped in.
Okay, cool.
So just to elaborate a little bit on the motivation, if you want to go back to the previous slide, I'm really focusing on making sure that that bundling is consistent with the needs of content blockers, because if this is going to be on the web, there's a lot of different things that user agents do. So I think the sub-resource loading case can be done in a way that's particularly amenable to that. Whereas some of these other features, it's not clear how how they would fit together. So I wanted to sort of focus on the agreeable parts first, and I guess we can talk more about details later.
Yep. I also
Thank
see
you.
Martin.
Martin Thompson, please.
I like the fact that when you mute and unmute, someone else is talking, there's a gap. So I missed my name there. But I think this is the right sort of thing to be trying to think about right now. It was good to see in the early designs how you had a fairly maximal design, but when it comes to getting it done, a very narrowly targeted small thing is more likely to be successful here. One of the things that I was thinking in terms of, if we get this wrong, for instance, if perhaps one of these cuts a little too deep, there's always the opportunity of defining another format with a different MIME type, something like that. And that gives us a pretty big escape hatch. So I'm not worried about really cutting severely unless we have an immediate use case for the feature. And that particularly relates to the critical thing.
Right. And we can, we still have some time between adopting the document and publishing it that we can also change our minds.
Right, because we might learn that we really, really need something, and that's fine.
Exactly.
The other thing that I wanted to briefly ask before you get into all of these other things is if you could talk a little bit about the current state of thinking with respect to the integration of this into the rest of the ecosystem, because there's been a lot of discussion about that. Many words have been spilled on GitHub Markdown, and I have not been able to read all of them. And so just getting a brief couple of minute overview on that would be pretty helpful.
Are you thinking how we specify everything, or where it sits in, like, or kind of how clients will behave?
Yeah, probably more in the client's behavior sort of thing. So how would I expect to use one of these bundles, and
right.
How would I expect to pull things out of them primarily?
Right. So a lot of that is still up in the air. I know you wrote a blog post with a suggestion that looks quite plausible. Right now, Chrome
I was plagiarizing.
Yeah. Chrome is working on an origin trial that that loads things in a kind of less cautious way. The origin trial, which runs from Chrome 90, which is releasing soon, to Chrome 92, allows you to use a link equals bundle to say use this bundle for sub resources within the current page, and then anything in the bundle kind of intercepts stuff that the page loaded or page asks to load. The likely eventual answer is that we'll have some sort of fetch map or loading map that declares, like, this bundle is used for or has these entry points, and then those requests from the page are intercepted by the bundle. Other things are probably not intercepted by the bundle, and then the bundle can have internal references of some sort to say, if I name this URL, it comes back to me. I think there's still an open question of kind of exactly how the bundle does that. We in the Chrome origin trial, there's a way to load an iframe from a bundle, but the URL of the iframe is provided by something else in the bundle, and so the something else in the bundle has to be able to say, make sure to load this iframe from me. I suspect we can make that work, but it's not all figured out yet.
Yeah. So I think the piece that would be missing for people listening along here was the fetch maps concept, which is essentially this idea where you embed in the web page a map that says, when I provide this URL, reinterpret that to mean this other URL. And so the browser will then take all references to this resource that it sees and replace it with a reference to another resource. And that allows you to do things like point to. things inside bundles, for instance. And it also allows for a bunch of other use cases in terms of managing your content. But I think that's critical. So I'll let you get on with it now. Thanks for indulging me.
Thank you. Well, Daniel's back.
Yeah, I want to articulate an intermediate step between these two things of atomically loading the whole bundle and this whole fetch map with dependencies. And this is something that I was hoping to have prepared in time for this meeting, but haven't yet, which is that you have a bundle which contains the client asks for a list of assets that are expected to be contained in the bundle, but it only fetches particular subsets as needed. I think this is really important for loading performance in a way that when you have a large application which is split into several sub-resources and they may be already loaded or maybe cached, then it can be important to do this kind of incremental loading. I think, I would like to come back to this group for more feedback on this kind of intermediate proposal, but it's not fully fleshed out yet.
Yeah, and the integration. Sorry, go ahead. The integration of bundle fetching with the HTTP cache is also not fully worked out. We think that we can make them interact well, but we haven't actually written everything down. So moving ahead to the concrete proposals for taking things or changing things before we adopt the draft. The first one is about taking the primary or fallback URL out of that header invariant section and moving it into an actual section, into an extension section. This happens because for sub-resource loading, there isn't a particular primary URL. And so the current draft says leave it empty. It becomes more important for top-level documents where if you don't understand, if the client doesn't understand the bundle, there is a fallback. It could redirect somewhere. And so it is plausible to move this to a section, but it means that clients just fail when they get a bundle they don't understand instead of being able to recover. I can take any discussion on this now, or we could go through everything and then come back and go through and kind of take hums for whether to accept these or reject them for the initial adopted version.
Well, Martin's back.
Hi. So in this case here, you're imagining that if you have a primary URL, there would be a specific type of section that would contain this information. Is there any ordering requirements you're talking about?
There is not a particular ordering requirement, although if you request a bundle or try to load a bundle and the client wants to use the primary URL to pick which resource out of it to load as a result, then you have to wait for the primary URL to be received before you can actually load that resource. So it should be one of the earlier sections in the bundle.
Right, but you don't necessarily have any structural constraints that would force it to be in a particular place.
Nope.
And it's just in this case, it would be just a section that is annotated differently, or is it a different type of section? I'm trying to understand what special behavior you're attributing to this, as opposed to just having this as metadata.
So each section has a name, and so like the index section and the resources section, responses section, they each have a string name, and so my PR creates a new section name for the primary URL. I think the different use cases of bundles have quite different semantics for what this primary or fallback URL would mean. It differs a lot from, an EPUB, future publishing thing, from something in which case we have these things about fallback semantics, but I think what fallback means differs a lot based on how something is deployed. And so this is a major reason why I think it really makes sense to separate this. So given that index is not forced to be in a particular place linearly in the sections, I think it makes sense to also not have this requirement for the primary or fallback URL. I don't think it would be bad to create such a restriction, though. If you look at WebAssembly's binary format, they have a similar architecture with section names, but they currently have a restriction on the ordering of sections, and they're considering relaxing that. But it's there are just lots of valid points to the design space here.
So one thing that occurred to me is that
I'd like to just make a quick note that we seem to be discussing this now as though this is already a working group adopted item, and now we are refining the document. And it's a very interesting discussion, but I'm wondering if we should maybe focus on whether you see this as being fundamentally at odds with adopting this as an item to work on.
If that's how you want to roll this, then maybe we should just go through the items just briefly, and we can avoid discussing them. I think this is a reasonable thing. But
I agree. It's a very engaging conversation. I think it is entirely reasonable. One of our main objectives in this session, though, was to identify whether we had a document that was ready to be adopted and worked on by the working group. And I was just feeling at the moment like we're already working on it as though it's been adopted.
I can get through the rest of the slides, and then we can kind of go back, and if we have extra time, we could discuss these as if we have adopted it. Okay, so the current draft includes a way to negotiate for content. That's in there mostly because it was trying to represent what HTTP can do, and there's some theory that offline use cases will use this, for instance, for multiple languages or maybe for multiple formats. Online use cases will almost certainly negotiate for the bundle as a whole. It is really inefficient to send 2 copies of a resource when you're actually sending it over a network. So online use cases, especially including the sub-resource loading use case, will probably not actually use the content negotiation information. In the current format, it costs 1 or 2 bytes per resource to kind of support content negotiation if you're not using it. So it's not a very expensive thing to support, but it does cost some implementation complexity. And so there's a suggestion to remove that from the current version. It would be possible to add a different section type that then re-adds it. But the question of whether we will actually wind up using content negotiation at all is, I think, an interesting one, even for offline use cases. Next slide. So the manifest section allows you to provide the, for instance, app manifest for a web page or site that you're providing as a bundle. It's not likely to be used for sub-resource loading. And it's also somewhat redundant with the top-level document in most cases. So maybe we should move this out of the core and into an extension document. Next slide. And the critical section is about kind of forward compatibility, making sure that it is possible to say that a particular client shouldn't load a bundle if it doesn't support some new section type that we define later. It's, of course, inefficient to actually collide with the critical section because it means that you have to kind of fall back in some way or fail the load in any online case. But it's also hard to add this later because we need kind of earlier implementations to reject things with sections they don't understand. So I would prefer not to take this pull request, but I want to leave it up to the working group. I think that's the last slide. And so then we can discuss whether kind of which of these to accept for the purpose of adopting the draft. And then we can discuss the content of them and kind of whether to do them after adopting the draft or whether to undo them after adopting the draft.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. Sean will be miking back in.
No, I was just miking back in to say, yeah, those were the last slides, and that is the way forward. So do you want to, Dave, do you want to try to run this?
Sure. We're just going to use the hand tool to do a basic show. We're going to ask in the affirmative first. Should we adopt this draft as a, or should we formally as a working group document? And so you should be able to pop over to the hand and raise your hand if you indeed think that this is a good starting point for the work of the charter of the group, in line with the charter of the group, I mean to say. And I will also ask again after this really quickly to see if there's any, I'll ask the negative to see whether there's objections to working with this document. We have a few buzzed in. Oh, Francesca is, our AD is stepping in to.
I just wanted to say that we have some questions to Jabber, and to remind to say that the hand showing button, show of hands tool, is in the top, the 5th button from the left. And that's where you can raise your hand or not.
We'll let it run for another 30 seconds or so.
I mean, so the process point here is what we're going to do is we're going to take this as a sense of the room, and then we'll take it to the list.
Right, because formally, yeah. Right. But I will say that so far the sense of the room is pretty clearly in favor. A couple of people elected not to raise their hand, but that's not necessarily an objection. But I'm going to end the poll right now. 12 people raised their hand, 2 didn't raise out of the 27 participants. Of course, there's some double counting in the number of participants that are represented. So we'll do once more. Do you check to and if you want to affirmatively say you have no objections, you can click explicitly the do not raise hand. And we're not going to let it go too long either. It's a small crowd. Most people are buzzing in pretty quickly. Okay, so far we have 9 with no objections and 0 objecting. So we're going to take that as a positive result to bring back to the list to formalize the adoption. Sean, back to you. Or perhaps back to Jeffrey now, because we have time in the session to discuss the other issues in the document if we want to resume.
So the only point I was going to make is that the action item is now on me as well to make sure we get this GitHub repo up, because I think that's where we decided we wanted to go ahead and do this draft. And so I will finally get off my keister and get that done.
Yep.
One note that we discussed kind of offline is that I am planning to rename the draft to WPACK bundled responses because it's no longer about exchanges. We figured out how to kind of represent everything as HTTP response messages.
Okay. Thank you, Jeffrey. DKG, please.
Hi there. I'm relaying P. Snyder from Jabber, who is unable to dial in. He says that Brave and he believes IO, although he doesn't speak for them, have both stated serious concerns with the implications for opinionated and blocking clients. Others who do content blocking have registered similar concerns on the original GitHub issue that he filed. I know JY and MT have found these concerns either mistaken or a cost worth the benefit from the proposal or similar. I don't mean to relitigate that here, but I wanted to re-note that the folks most invested in or concerned with content blocking are the folks who have raised the loudest concerns. Some of the previously noted rejections or responses to those concerns are from vendors who do relatively less content blocking in their products. I hope the group will consider the content blocking concerns going forward and will invite input from content blocking folks with those same concerns.
Thank you, TKG, and P. Snyder. Martin Thompson, please. Actually, I was personally quite happy with both Martin and Daniel in their three-way conversation before. I'm sorry I interrupted the flow. We had an objective to get to, but Daniel, if you want to jump in and continue this kind of roundtable you were having, works for me.
Right,
Sure.
So, there he is. Welcome. So I think
Can I speak first to Pete's point? Pete was mentioning this content blocking concerns, and one aspect of those concerns was about whether it's appropriate to have a bundle to be representing a full page on the web, as if the bundling would sort of take over how websites work and make them this one big opaque item, which differs from sub-resource loading, which is maybe more granular. And this also relates to subsetting. So my intention has been to, with these PRs that we've discussed, has been to work towards resolving those concerns. I mean, some concerns relate to how it integrates with HTML, and there's still more work to do there. But I want to ask Pete if these removals that we're talking about help work towards your goals.
Jeffrey, I think that was kicked back to you.
I see Pete on the Jabber saying, yes, I think they do.
Okay.
So that is helpful.
So I wanted to just make sure that it was fairly clear here that this is a starting point. To all those involved, this is just where we start the journey, and I think Pete and others have registered this concern, and I think that there is some potential risk here that we do something very bad for those sorts of I guess what we call semantic availability type features, where we as consumers of the information get to know what that information is and the semantics of that information. There are risks, and we could potentially design something that's very, very bad for those particular use cases. But I think we need to make sure that we work through all of those things. There's probably a bunch of other things in this list that are also similarly bad for various other reasons. I noticed PHP earlier mentioned having indexes at the end, so it'd be easier to change the contents of bundles, things like that. That's an objection that I don't share, but it would be good to recognize that the objection exists and we need to address it.
And I'll also just read in Pete Snyder's comment for the record. I think it is a core for the sub-resource loading that is great, and being able to split the sub-resource case from the document case seems valuable. Would you like to have any more discussion on issues now, or if there's no more feedback, we can take it to the list for further work.
Let's go through these four and kind of double check how the room feels.
Okay.
And then just as kind of the source for the initial working group draft. So right, how do people feel about moving the it becomes a primary URL if we put it in a section. It can't really be used for fallback anymore.
Martin's coming on. Yep.
Probably right. The idea of a fallback was an interesting one. And that was largely for sort of compatibility reasons. You wanted to make sure that when you sent one of these bundles to someone, if they didn't know how to deal with it because critical stuff or what have you, they had somewhere to go. They had the escape hatch. I don't feel the need for having that sort of feature myself so acutely. And one of the things that Daniel and I were discussing briefly in the chat just now was the potential for the entry point to be different for different applications of the same bundle. So if you imagine that a bundle represents a book, if you have an ebook reader, maybe it has one entry point. If you have a phone, maybe it has a different entry point. And if you're using a desktop browser, maybe it has a different entry point again. And so you can imagine having different labels or annotations on resources that allow someone to pick the one that suits them best. I don't know whether this is metadata for the individual resources in the bundle, or whether it is sections. We should probably debate that.
My feeling is that the way that you represent metadata is in a particular named section, and we just define that that section contains certain metadata. The reason to have a primary URL is when you kind of navigate to the bundle itself and you want to know what to load. And so something that dispatches based on like the client form factor or whatever could be represented inside of that primary resource, or it could be done as kind of a section with a map itself. I think those are reasonably equivalent.
Yes, there's many ways to skin this particular cat. Yep.
The only thing we lose by moving this to a section is that it can't be used for fallback. And I agree with Daniel that that's not necessary for sub-resources where you have a public URL anyway that you're just replacing with the bundle. If the bundle doesn't load, you just load the resource from the network.
Yeah, I guess this goes back to the question of what we believe the referencing infrastructure to look like. And so if you imagine that the referencing infrastructure provides a link to a non-bundled resource or a bundled resource, then you already have that fallback built in at the next layer up. You don't have to worry about dealing with bundles in order to get the capability.
I think eventually I think I would like a hum for this, like whether to accept this PR, just to like get confirmation from the room, but it feels like we're leaning toward accepting it.
Okay. And how would you like me actually to phrase that? Could we accept issue 617 as a work item?
Daniel on the queue, but yes.
Yeah.
Or, well, we should accept 617 for the initial working group draft.
Yeah, I think merge is the right term, right? So we'll merge this. This is it an issue or a PR?
PR.
It's a PR. So yeah, merge the PR into the draft for the initial submission as a working group item.
I wanted to mention that my intention for this, for factoring it into a separate section, was also to take a second step and say, well, actually this moves to some other document, the way that, you know, the other things that I'm proposing removing, it's not removing forever, just it could move to some other document. So I think that you know, adopting this or merging this PR, we might consider that follow-on work, or not, depending. You know, it's a separate question.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. The poll is up and so far extremely lightly attended. We have only 2 people registering anything. Yes, Martin.
To be fair, unable to. So,
You broke up a little there, Martin. Can you repeat, please?
to be fair, some of the people who perhaps would like to participate cannot. So
Right, right.
there you have it. I was going to ask Jeffrey, though, do you have arguments in favor of rejecting the PR?
I think that the fallback URL is useful, and putting it in the core format costs very little, and supports some longer term work. But I don't feel super strongly.
And I will say, because we shouldn't let the hum drag on for too long, that overall it was a very quiet, positive hum. Only 7 people actively clicked a button at all, and 5 of them were saying go ahead and merge it. So it's not a vote, but it is weakly in favor of going ahead with it.
The next slide then.
You just got quiet, Jeffrey.
Sorry, let's go to the next slide then.
Okay. Yeah, now you're.
Okay, removing content negotiation. It is some implementation complexity, a byte or 2 per resource in size, and probably not used for sub-resource loading, but likely used for some of the offline cases that we hope to support in the long term. Please discuss.
Yeah, hop in, Daniel.
Yeah, I think this makes sense out of if you're thinking about sub-resource loading, it's the online case. It seems quite strange to think through how the semantics would work at runtime. It seems to add more complexity to that the sub-resource loading case would have to handle, have to decide what to do when there's bundles that have these multiple representations and what to put in cache. For the content blocking story, I think this really comes back to separating bundling for sub-resource loading versus bundling for whole websites. The content blocking case makes more sense in whole websites, and I don't know if that is valuable as a thing for web browsers to load online. Offline usage by things that are not general purpose web browsers, I think, is a separate question. So that's kind of the motivation for separating content negotiation in my mind. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure, Daniel just kind of abruptly dropped. Martin, please.
This one's difficult for me because I can immediately see the value of having things like multiple languages or those cases where you have multiple different image sizes for the different form factors that are involved. Actually, that one's not a great example now that I think about it again. But having, for example, all of the different CSS that you would require for display on small screens and large screens and whatnot, rather than the customized single user agent, single form factor CSS that is often delivered in web cases, the online cases. So I'm kind of on the fence with this one. Again, I'll probably ask Jeffrey, but why would you? What specific reasons would you give for keeping it?
So you have mentioned the reasons to keep it. There's one other more speculative one that I didn't list on the slide, which is that in cases where the server would check one of the say sec-fetch headers, saying and wants to constrain how resources are used, you can use or maybe abuse content negotiation to say, like, if sec-fetch dest is such and such, then the resource exists, and otherwise it doesn't, and actually like use that to block inappropriate use from within the bundle. I'm not sure if that's a use or an abuse, but I think it will work if we include content negotiation. But more often it's for offline uses.
Which also makes me wonder whether we have an answer to the question of, can we do cores with bundles? But as the implicit thing is, it's a GET request for the URL that's listed. I don't think that's possible, which sort of cuts a lot of those scenarios out where you could say, okay, here's my bundle as content, and it is available for reading by these other origins as well as this current one. That's not something that's possible in this format either.
I don't understand the course point. You have response headers, right? What do request headers have to do with? I mean, how does that?
You would have to put the response headers that would normally appear in an options request, wouldn't you? There's only certain types of resources that you can load with a cross-origin request.
Right. So I wanted to mention that I previously proposed that we have the normal index section, which would be without content negotiation, and then a separate negotiated index section that would be more optional, that you would use for your subset of resources that you actually wanted to do content negotiation on. So you could have a basic bundle, which has nothing negotiated, and then this advanced bundle format, which has this second index. So that adds some complexity versus saying that there's always content negotiation. But it means that we're not forcing the entire format to be thrown away to add that, because we have this extensible section architecture.
I'm not a huge fan of having of doing it with two different section types, because which one does the server send? It definitely shouldn't send both, because that wastes a bunch of space. But Daniel's right that we can do it that way. So I'd eventually like the same hum that we did for the last time.
Sure.
Oh, and Pete wrote in the Jabber that removing content negotiation is important to him. First, it makes it more likely that we'll maintain benefits of content blocking because we're less likely to fetch multiple versions of the same resource. And two, it makes personalization less likely, although not impossible. I don't follow really either of those, but that is what Pete wrote.
Hey, so what's kind of emerging in the chat room, I think, is that what we may end up doing actually is just adopting the -04 version of this draft, or making that the actual call for adoption and getting it in, and then we can use these PRs as like the first, first revision to get it in the door, so that we don't have to get hung up on trying to have you publish in 05 before we go ahead and do the adoption call. Does that sound like it would work for everybody?
It's fine with me.
Works for me.
All right, cool. I mean, in some sense, it makes it much easier for me, because now there's not a gating function. It might make me look better if he takes a week, so that I can get the GitHub repo up. But I have the funny suspicion that he can hit the merge button faster than I can get the repo set up. So let's just go with the thought that we'll try to get 04 out. Will be the actual baseline document, and then we can merge these in later, assuming that it's not hard to push pull requests from one branch to another. But you guys are probably better at GitHub than I am.
It will require recreating them, because it's not going to just be a move the repository, but it's easy to apply diffs.
Thanks.
One thing that, if we put that one to bed, one thing that occurred to me on this content negotiation thing is when I was thinking about the image case in particular, that does sort of lead me to think that perhaps we don't really need content negotiation for the purposes of having multiple images and whatnot. So one of the original problems with the personalization aspects of bundling was that you either had to provide all the variants of a particular image, say, you know, the high DPI version of the image and the little thumbnail for the small screen. But then you're just using up all the bits for all the confidential real explosion there. Whereas you might as well just send all of the bits for the really high res thing and just have the client downscale, because it's had to download the bits anyway. It doesn't have a lot of choice in the offline case. So that sort of deals with that problem. And maybe you've got AVIF and JPEG and all the different formats. You just aim for the lowest common denominator so that everyone can consume the content. Put as many pixels as you think you need, and you're done. The only one that sort of makes some sense is things like making content available. And so if it's translations or the like, then that's something that's interesting. I do sort of wonder whether there are options available to someone who doesn't have content negotiation available to them that would still work in that scenario. It just means structural differences. So rather than serving the same page that's got to vary based on accept language, which for various reasons I don't like anyway, the site says, I'm going to serve the same content to everyone, and write some script that says, if the native language is English, well, we'll pull out the English translation or what have you. It's not as easy, but it certainly makes the overall format much easier to reason about.
Thank you, Martin. Jeffrey, did you still want to hum on that particular issue, just so you know where to go forward post?
Since we'll be taking these for the working group draft 01, taking them or not, I think it would still be useful to get the hum on kind of whether the working group wants to adopt them.
Okay. I probably should have said that audibly for people who are listening but not necessarily looking. The poll, the hand tool was active right now to chime in on this PR. Yeah, and Pete is added his hand in. It looks pretty even, I'm going to have to say. Again, with a fairly lightly attended participation, there's a slight bias toward removing it, but it's really very even, even when I factor in Pete's additional hand. So I think I'm going to have to say that probably warrants further discussion on the list.
Thank you. Okay, do we move the manifest section out of the core document and into an extension document that we would adopt separately? Manifest section is already optional. Things don't have to include it in a bundle.
not much feedback here at the moment. So oh, Martin's back.
Some sort of discussion.
Yeah.
Say something. So I think a manifest is another type of top-level thing that you might want to go looking for. And again, the question comes down to whether you have a dedicated section for this thing, or whether you have an individual resource that is annotated as being a manifest. Those are the things that I think I'd like to pursue, rather than having this is where the manifest exists. And then that gives you some flexibility in terms of what your manifest actually looks like, because the manifest that a web browser looks for, the web application manifest, which is a JSON file, probably looks a little different than the sort of thing that, let's just say, the Java jar file executor runs. If people were crazy enough to port that to using a format like this. It might actually work, by the way, but that sort of thing.
And so you're saying that we should move this out of the core so that we can define different section names for the different kinds of manifests.
Right. And so, yeah, ebooks, web pages, ES6 modules maybe have some sort of meta information they might want to convey at some point. I don't know. All of the above.
The current design says you give a URL and then you content negotiate for the one you want. And if we pull content negotiation out, then of course that doesn't work.
Right.
All right, so we're here. We're running up into the time constraints of our hour session. So I think what we're going to do is take these two removals, because there's this one with that and the removal of the critical section to the list. And we'll start that after we get the working group draft in the door. Does that sound like a way forward?
That sounds great.
Daniel?
Would folks be interested in an interim session to discuss this as well as sub-resource loading details?
You're stealing my thunder, man. That was my next point. So I'm hoping that we can try to set up, after we get the working group, after we do the working group adoption call and the repo setup and stuff, that we actually try to have an interim. I'm not thinking weeks. I'm thinking like a month and a half away, so that people have had some time to, get motivated and do some stuff, and then try to have an interim. Again, I think we should take this to the list, but I was definitely thinking the same thing, Daniel. So, in the parting shot of a minute, let me see, how do you start a session? Interested in an interim. Let's start one of those little polls. You can jump over there and throw your hand up or down and see how it goes. I think I'll still take it to the list. I guess the other thing is, thanks for your time. Thanks for taking notes, Chris. All right, well, we got, eight runners, one no raise hand. So, I think if we had 10 people that were active that showed up to an interim, I would be ecstatic. So thanks for that. Thanks for your participation. Thanks, Dave, for running most of the show here. Let's do it, and we'll see you all on the internet.
Bye, all.